Have you ever witnessed someone being treated poorly because of their appearance, right in the place where they should be treated the most? A seemingly ordinary evening at a fancy restaurant, but turned into a moment that exposed the deepest things in people's hearts. A calm, polite, elderly black woman was repeatedly ignored and looked down upon by a waiter, as if she didn't deserve to be there. But what the waiter didn't know was that the woman he looked down on was the restaurant owner's mother. If it were you, what would you do? Would you stand up to protect strangers? Stay silent and watch the wrongs happen? Or would you do what many people do? Look away. That moment forces each of us to ask ourselves in an unjust situation, who would I become? Let this story guide you back to your heart. If you believe that kindness still has value in this world, please keep listening. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread heart-touching stories like this. That evening, the Silver Monarch was a symphony of light and movement. Crystal chandeliers hung from the nearly 20-foot ceiling, casting a warm golden glow like a winter sunset. The polished walnut dining tables reflected the small candles that swayed gently in the breeze from the air conditioning system. Each set of silver cutlery was placed at the correct distance, as if the entire restaurant were practicing for some solemn ritual. The guests tonight were mostly businessmen. Some wore tuxedos, some wore cashmere scarves, some had just left the office after hours-long meetings. They talked about the same things: contracts, investments, the real estate market, and occasionally burst out laughing when recalling an old story. The sound mingled with the gentle sound of a cello playing nocturne from a small corner of the stage. None of them knew that, in just a few minutes, a seemingly small, seemingly normal event would touch the deepest thing in everyone's heart: respect. The thick glass door opened. A cold wind blew in from outside, and there she was, an elderly black woman, walking slowly but steadily, a graceful figure in a navy wool coat. She was unpretentious. No expensive jewelry, no designer bags, no fuss, just calm, polite, and a very strange demeanor. The demeanor of someone who had been through too many storms but not let them get on her face. Her name is Evelyn Carter. As she walked in, a few chairs moved, not intentionally, not that anyone was trying to be confrontational, but they looked at her as if she didn't really belong in this place, the most exclusive restaurant in Seattle's Carver district. Mrs. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a few seconds, adjusting the thin silk scarf around her neck. The candlelight reflected on her cheeks, making her look strangely gentle, but her eyes seemed to hide a certain thoughtfulness. Looking deeper, one could see the weariness, not the weariness of age, but the weariness of having grown too accustomed to the weariness of this world. Behind the reception desk stood a young woman. Her blonde hair was tied back, and her smile had been practiced over hundreds of shifts. But when Evelyn approached, her smile faded a little, not noticeably, but enough to be noticed. "Good evening," said Mrs. Evelyn, her voice as soft as a breath, but clear and sure. The hostess looked at her, then quickly glanced at the guests sitting at the tables near the window, the guests who seemed more suitable, and her eyes full of implicit standards. In a somewhat tense voice, she asked, "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes. I put it under the name Evelyn Carter." The girl tapped quickly on the screen, then nodded. There was no welcoming smile, no warm invitation to come in like she had done with the white couple, just a dry nod. She led her further inside, but not to the fancy tables by the window, where the evening light painted a picture. She led her to a small table near the kitchen door, where the occasional clatter of dishes could be heard, a table that few people want to sit at. But Mrs. Evelyn did not complain. She smiled, gently untied the silk scarf, folded it neatly, and placed it on her lap. She took a deep breath. A peaceful evening. That was what she had hoped for. Just a simple meal. No big expectations. A few minutes passed, then another few. The chatter and laughter continued around her. Waiters kept coming and going, but no one stopped at her table. Not a drink, not a question. There was only silence. Suddenly, a middle-aged man at the next table glanced over, then quickly looked away. He looked as if he was trying to figure something out, as if the sight of the elderly black woman sitting alone in this glamorous space made him want to understand, but not know whether to care or not. Evelyn flipped through the menu gently. She tried to keep her mind calm, as she always had after years of learning to live in spaces where she had to prove her worthiness. A sadness flickered in her eyes, but she hid it with a deep breath. From a far corner of the restaurant, another man was watching her. Unlike the curious or confused looks of the other customers, this man's eyes contained familiarity, a hint of worry, and something deeper than mere concern. He sat alone at the bar. His hand tapped the glass lightly, as he did when trying to calm himself. His eyes never left Evelyn for a second. His name is Daniel Carter. No one here knows that he is the CEO of Carter Capital and also the founder of this restaurant, the Silver Monarch, a powerful, wealthy, and influential man. But tonight, he was just a son watching his mother being treated unfairly, and he didn't know whether he should stand up immediately or wait a little longer to reveal the true nature of the waiter who was doing something wrong. No one in the restaurant understood that with each passing minute. The atmosphere was becoming as tense as a bowstring. Something is waiting to explode. And when it happens, none of them will ever look at this world the same way again. Seattle evenings have a special feel. The damp chill from Puget Sound creeps down the streets, down the steps, and into the skin. A reminder that this city is made of a mixture of beauty and harshness. Evelyn Carter has always loved this weather. It reminds her that she has survived colder, harsher things. Now she sat in a quiet corner of the Silver Monarch, her hands lightly touching the smooth wood of the tabletop, her eyes scanning the menu she had read for the third time, not because she couldn't see clearly, but because her mind wasn't quite there. In the candlelight, her face was lined with soft lines, as if drawn by time. There were lines of smiles. There were lines of patience. There were lines from the long nights when she had to tell herself she was strong enough to go on. Especially those eyes. Those eyes had a depth that made others look twice. On the outside she was calm, but inside she had a life of wandering. That woman didn't need to speak loudly for others to know she was strong. She just needed to sit there and take a breath. And that was enough for those who paid attention to her to realize she had a special inner strength. Perhaps, if people looked at her more closely, they would realize that she was not an ordinary woman who stopped by the restaurant. She is Evelyn Carter, CEO of Carter Innovations, one of the fastest growing green technology corporations in the Northwest United States. But tonight, she chose to appear as just a guest, a woman who wanted a peaceful meal after a long day. She didn't want to carry a title. She didn't want anyone to recognize her. She didn't want to attract attention, because when people recognized her, they often looked at her differently, with respect, wariness, and curiosity. She wanted a normal evening, even though normalcy was a luxury for her. Evelyn has always known she was different, not just because she was a black woman in a technology industry dominated for decades by white men, but because she had to overcome barriers that many people had never seen or understood. When she was young, she once walked into an important meeting with a plan she had been preparing for 2 months. The man sitting at the head of the table looked her up and down, then said something she would never forget. "Miss, the restroom is over there. The cleaning staff don't come in through this door." At that time, she was only 26 years old. Evelyn told the story to her son, Daniel Carter, when he was a freshman in college, but she only told it once. She didn't want it to become an excuse for bitterness. She didn't want her son to grow up with an angry view of the world. She wanted Daniel to understand that the world isn't fair, but that people can still choose to be kind. And from that year, she swore, "I will not let anyone decide my worth." But that oath, strong as it was, could not always save her heart from moments of injustice. Like tonight. Evelyn recognized those moments from afar, like when you get used to the smell of rain. All it takes is one drop to let you know it's about to rain. A few glances, a frown, a smile that stops halfway, a slight in the hostess's voice. All those little details were captured very clearly by her. But there was one thing the people in the restaurant tonight could not know. Evelyn's gentleness was not weakness. It was the result of a lifetime of learning to stand firm when the world tried to shake her. Whenever she feels overwhelmed, she returns to an old habit, placing her hands lightly on the table, breathing out slowly, and thinking about the person who taught her to live with compassion, her mother. The woman once told her, "You can't control how other people see you, but you can control how you see yourself." Evelyn smiled slightly as she remembered that saying. She snapped back to reality. Still no one came to her table. No water. No greetings. Just laughter from the table next door, where a group of young people were clinking glasses. She wasn't angry, just a little deflated. Just then, a figure passed by the corner of the bar. Tall, broad-shouldered, sitting in a familiar manner. Evelyn recognized him immediately. It was her son, Daniel. She wasn't surprised. Daniel often visited her restaurant whenever he had some free time in the evening. But what caught her attention was that her son was looking straight at her. Not the usual hello mom look, but it was the look of someone trying to keep calm. Evelyn looked away slightly, as if to reassure him, "I'm fine." She didn't say it out loud, but Daniel understood. She knew Daniel understood. The boy always saw her every little movement, every new wrinkle, every hidden sigh. Since childhood, Daniel has had a special sensitivity to his mother's emotions. But it is this sensitivity that makes it difficult for Daniel to calm down whenever he sees his mother being treated wrongly. Evelyn looked at her son in his charcoal gray jacket, tapping his finger on the rim of his glass. She knew that when Daniel tapped his glass like that, he was having a small storm inside, a storm he was trying to contain. And she knew one more thing. If Daniel stood up tonight, things would be different. Evelyn took a deep breath, then smiled slightly to herself. She didn't want Daniel to see this, but she also understood life sometimes puts mother and son in the exact place where they need to face the truth. At that moment, a young waiter came out from the kitchen, wearing a white shirt and a black apron, walking hurriedly but without enthusiasm. His eyes swept over Evelyn coldly. His name is Mark Harris, and she had a feeling that, tonight, he would reveal more than he wanted. At the bar, Daniel watched Mark. Their eyes never met, but Daniel saw enough in his few gestures. Evelyn sat up straight, adjusting her silk scarf. She had no idea what was coming, but she did know this. She came in the evening just to have dinner. And in the evening, preparing to teach a lesson to someone else. Mark Harris emerged from the double kitchen doors, a tray of drinks in his hand, his gaze sweeping over the rows of tables in his area. The faint steam rising from the glasses made the yellow light reflect in faint streaks. Everything looked cozy and harmonious, but that harmony only existed for those Mark deemed worthy of serving. As for Mrs. Evelyn, she was not on that list. Mark is the type of person who has unreasonably high self-esteem. He once told a colleague that working at the Silver Monarch allowed him to meet real class, but his standards were pitifully narrow. He looked at clothes, skin color, and apparent wealth to determine how to treat people. And tonight, Mark decided from the moment he saw Evelyn walk in that she didn't belong here. No one knew that in the first few minutes. Mark had realized that Mrs. Evelyn looked familiar. But instead of thinking further, he chose to believe the first negative assumption, one that he himself was not fully aware of. Mark brought water to the table across from Evelyn. A couple was celebrating their wedding anniversary. He bowed slightly, his smile widening. "Congratulations, both of you. Here's some water first. I'll be back with tonight's special." The friendly tone faded as he turned and walked past Evelyn's desk. He slowed his pace just enough to show he saw her, but he didn't stop. Daniel watched from the bar. His fingers tightened around the rim of his glass. It was a small movement, but enough to let anyone who knew him know that his patience was being tested. Evelyn remained silent, but her eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with familiarity, a feeling she had felt too many times in her life, a sadness as thin as mist, but lasting a lifetime. She put the menu back on the table. Her breathing was a little deep. A question flashed through her mind. Will tonight pass as peacefully as she wishes? Mark continued serving 2 more tables. He brought wine, suggested dishes, and chatted openly. Every time he returned to his area, he would glance at Evelyn, then look away, as if avoiding something. A few of the customers began to notice something was wrong. The middle-aged man at the table near the window squinted slightly, looking at Evelyn and then at Mark. His wife gently touched her husband's hand and whispered, "Do you see she hasn't been given water?" "I see." The husband replied in a low voice. "Indeed." Evelyn heard it, but she only nodded slightly, acknowledging the friendly look from afar. She didn't want to make a fuss. She never chose to make a fuss. But she thought that sometimes silence was a way to preserve dignity. The kitchen door opened again. Mark came out, not carrying a tray of drinks this time. He was holding a small iPad to take orders. He walked straight to Evelyn's table, then stopped suddenly a few feet away. His voice rose, not looking her in the eye. "We're a bit busy tonight. I'll come back when I can." Evelyn looked up. Her gaze was soft, non-confrontational. "No problem. I'll wait." Mark nodded, but his attitude was distant. He turned away for a moment, but he didn't know that the other person couldn't bear it anymore. Daniel stood up from the bar stool. Not an angry movement, not a loud step. He simply stood up with the air of a man who had decided he could not watch another minute. But as he was about to leave, his mother, Evelyn, glanced at him very slightly. Just one look. One look was enough to make Daniel stop. A look that says, "Let me handle it my way." Daniel took a deep breath. He sat back down, but his eyes followed Mark's every movement like headlights scanning a spot on the highway, focused, determined, ready for action. Evelyn had a silent battle going on inside her. She knew Daniel couldn't sit still. But she also knew that if her son stood up now, the public's gaze would turn the story into CEO defends mother with power. She didn't want that. She wanted the truth to speak for itself. She thought to herself, if a person cannot respect a normal customer, then he is not worthy to serve anyone. Near the window, a young girl sitting with her boyfriend whispered, "I think he was trying to avoid her table. It doesn't make sense." Her boyfriend nodded, his eyes watching intently. "Did you notice? The 4 tables that came after her already had their orders." Those small whispers did not carry far, but they were enough to create undercurrents in the air. Injustice does not need noise. It only needs time. Another 5 minutes passed. Mark walked past Evelyn's desk again. Evelyn raised her hand as lightly as a breeze. "Excuse me." Mark stopped for half a second, his eyes unable to hide his discomfort. "Yes. What do you need? I would like to order, if possible." Mark replied without hiding the casualness in his voice. "I'll be back in a minute." Then he turned away before she could say anything more. Evelyn exhaled slowly. The breath seemed to keep her heart from straying from the serenity she had built over the decades. But this time, a small sadness crept into the depths of her eyes. Daniel saw it all. His chest heaved as if someone had just pressed down on a heavy rock. He looked at his mother. Her eyes looked at him. Their eyes met in a moment of utter silence, but the kind of silence that made one want to leap up and destroy the injustice before them. The evening manager, Mary Ann Young, noticed something from a distance. She had worked at the restaurant for almost 5 years and had rarely seen Daniel with such an expression. She walked closer to him and said softly, "Is everything okay?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He just looked at his mother's table and said, "Just watch that table. Don't interfere. Not yet." Mary Ann paused. She didn't understand the specifics, but she sensed that tonight was not going to be like any other evening. Mark appeared again, holding a menu for another table. He still avoided Evelyn's eyes as if avoiding the truth he didn't want to face. Evelyn glanced at him, then placed her hands lightly on the table, palms pressed against the smooth wood. She felt the cold of the tabletop run up her arms. It was a strange sensation, as if her body was reminding her that there were wounds, however small, that could make her heart ache. She thought to herself, "I've survived this kind of thing my whole life. But why does it make me so tired tonight?" And she had no idea that it would be that feeling that would guide everything that was about to happen. Daniel sat up straight, his eyes never leaving his mother. Tonight, justice is coming closer by the minute, and Mark had no idea that his small actions were being held in a light he never imagined. In the Silver Monarch, the atmosphere always carried a quiet elegance, as if the entire restaurant were holding its breath together. But tonight, that breath was gradually skewed. Only one person caused it, but the ripple effect was too great to ignore. Mark Harris turned away, leaving Evelyn's desk in a silent void. She sat there, her hands clasped together, her gaze scanning the room as if she were looking at something far beyond the reality before her. She didn't complain. She didn't blame. That was what made people start to pay more attention A woman sitting at the opposite table, Rebecca Miller, a mid-level lawyer, watched the scene with unease. She placed her hand on her glass of white wine, but did not raise it to drink. Her professional instincts and those of someone who had faced injustice before kept her eyes fixed on the image of the elderly woman left behind in the crowded restaurant. "Do you see this happening?" she asked her husband. "David Miller?" David looked over, frowning when he saw Mrs. Evelyn still sitting quietly, no one waiting on her, not a glass of water in front of her. "I see," David said softly. "It's not her fault. It's clearly the attitude of the waiter." David was a gentle, non-confrontational type, but tonight there was something disapproving in his eyes. It wasn't the slow service. It was the fact that every table that came later had been well looked after, except her. The atmosphere begins to become unsettling, like when you're watching a smooth concert. But suddenly a wrong note rings out. Small, but it breaks the whole piece. In the corner, a group of young people also realized that. A curly-haired girl, about 30 years old, whispered to her friend, "They are doing something wrong to her." The friend replied, "Yeah, unbelievable in a restaurant like this." The whispers were small, fleeting, like the wind, but gradually became gentle waves spreading throughout the room. Daniel Carter heard it all from the bar. But what made his heart clench was his mother's patience. Evelyn Carter, the woman who had taught him to face injustice with equanimity, sat there, her back straight, her eyes not asking for pity. She sat like someone trying to keep her faith in goodness, even though it was being tested. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. But the look his mother sent him made him stop. Evelyn knew her son too well. He always acted with his heart before his head, but tonight she wanted something else. She wanted to see the nature of the problem, not the nature of the intervener. The kitchen door opened. Mark came out again, this time with a towel in his hand. He talked and laughed with the other workers. Every now and then, he glanced at Evelyn's table. There was something satisfied about the glance, as if he was used to choosing who to serve and who to ignore. Mary Ann, the night manager, stood behind the bar, her face full of concern. She couldn't hear everything, but she saw the strange look in the staff's eyes. Veterans like her knew something was brewing at a glance. She approached and whispered to Daniel, "Do you want me to intervene?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. We'll see." His voice was low, controlled, but tinged with suppressed tension. Mary Ann knew him as well as she knew herself. She could tell by his tone that he was reaching his limit. Meanwhile, Mark still didn't know that several eyes were following him, following his every step, following his every movement. At Evelyn's table, the cello changed to River Flows in You, a gentle melody, but full of emotion. The notes seemed to drift around her desk, painting a picture of a woman who had faced life's storms and tonight faced another kind of wind, silent, but no less heartbreaking. Evelyn exhaled, seemingly peacefully, but inside she was having a small conversation. "I'm so used to this feeling. Why does it still hurt like the first time every time it happens?" She squeezed two fingers together. No one else saw the tiny movement, but Daniel did, and he'd seen every detail since he was a child. The way his mother rubbed her wrists when she was nervous, the way she looked down at the table when she was trying to calm herself, and tonight he saw it all. There was a long silence as the waiter passed her table for the fourth time. Evelyn looked up. Her gaze was soft but steady. "Excuse me," she said softly. Mark paused for half a second, not bothering to turn around, just tilting his head reluctantly. "Yes. What do you need? I'd like to order, if possible." Mark sighed, not hiding his impatience. "I'm busy. I'll be back." Evelyn bowed her head slightly, not in resignation, but to keep herself calm. Just then, a wow came from David and Rebecca's table. They looked at each other, unable to believe what was happening. Rebecca whispered, "If he did that to my mother, I would have stood up long ago." David replied, "The problem is, her son is sitting right there." They both looked at Daniel. Daniel kept his eyes on his mother. His hands were clasped together, his thumbs twirling, a habit he had when he was trying to contain his anger. The whole room began to vibrate in an invisible way. No one said anything, but everyone knew something was wrong. A few more minutes passed, and then Something small happened, but it changed the whole atmosphere. Another young waiter, Chris Jacobs, passed Evelyn's table while delivering drinks. He looked at her with pity. When he finished serving his table, Chris bowed to Evelyn and said very quietly, "I'm sorry to keep you waiting." A small sentence, but it made Evelyn's heart sink. "It's okay, dear." She smiled gently. I understand. Evelyn was always more forgiving than she had ever experienced. But in the distance, Daniel saw the scene, and it wasn't just Mark that bothered him, but it was another employee who had to apologize for a mistake that wasn't his. Daniel stood up slightly, then sat back down. His emotions and his reason were fighting. His emotions wanted him to rush to his mother's defense. His reason wanted him to wait and see how far Mark's actions would go before he made a final decision. In that moment, Daniel realized something he had been trying to ignore since entering the bar. He is not just Evelyn's son. He is also the founder of this restaurant. And tonight, it seems he is being tested on his patience, kindness, and responsibility as a leader. At her desk, Evelyn took a deep breath. She was about to raise her hand again, but then she stopped. She looked around, at the looks of sympathy and mild anger. She understood that people were starting to come around to her, not with words, but with looks. One can be silent about many things, but not silent when witnessing obvious injustice. She knew the moment when everything would change was approaching, and when it happens, no one, not even Mark, will predict the consequences of actions that he considers just a bit of attitude. The atmosphere in the restaurant was like the surface of a lake on the verge of rain, still calm, but no longer calm. The wind had not yet picked up, but one could feel the change creeping in with every breath. Evelyn Carter sat up straight, her eyes still fixed on the center of the room. She tried to keep her face as calm as possible. The calmer she was, the more attention she drew to those around her. They didn't know who she was. They saw only a respectable, kind-looking older woman being treated in a way that made them uncomfortable, even though it was none of their business, and that insecurity began to speak for her. The kitchen door opened and Mark Harris reappeared. His clothes were still neat, but his eyes and demeanor betrayed nothing. He walked straight to a table filled with a group of young businessmen chatting animatedly. Their laughter was audible as Mark set down his cocktail glasses. One of the group asked, "Thank you. The table over there seems to have arrived before us. Haven't they been served yet?" Mark glanced at Evelyn's desk, then replied in a half-joking, half-meaning tone, "Oh, they probably aren't ready. And there are people who come here who don't have the right vibe. You know." He shrugged, taking it as a joke. But that joke was a knife. One young man in the group frowned. He did not join in the laughter. The others were silent for a moment. Not all of them agreed, but they were silent. Silent because they did not want to make waves. Silent because they were embarrassed. And that silence made Mark's words even heavier. "At the bar." Daniel Carter heard the words. His chest tightened. The words weren't just rude, they were insulting. An insult to an older woman's honor. An insult to his mother's dignity. An insult in the restaurant he'd built with his own hands. Marianne Young, the night manager, heard it too. She was standing less than 2 tables away. Her eyes widened. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel was still sitting, but his face was tense. Marianne whispered, "Daniel, that sentence went too far." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, but it didn't calm his heart as he had hoped. Evelyn still didn't know what that meant, but she sensed something was changing. The atmosphere in the restaurant felt as if an invisible weight was pressing down. Mark walked towards his mother, menu in hand. He stopped in front of Evelyn's table, but his attitude remained the same. Cold, disrespectful. "Finally, I have some free time. What would you like to order?" Evelyn looked up, her gaze still calm. But deep inside, she felt a pang of pain. Not because she was being looked down upon, but because the waiter did not see her as a person. "Thank you," said Mrs. Evelyn. "I would like to see the grilled salmon. Could you?" She had not finished her sentence when Mark interrupted. "Salmon is not suitable today. I think you should choose something simpler." Evelyn blinked, not because she was surprised, but because she realized Mark wasn't even trying to hide his disdain. You think I don't know how to choose. Mark shrugged, his eyes indifferent. I just want to help. Many older people like light food, and, you know. That unfinished sentence was enough for Evelyn to understand, and the people around her noticed too. A young woman at a nearby table turned to her husband and whispered, What does he mean? What if she's old? That's ridiculous. The husband replied, I'm starting to see he has a problem. Mark continued to take the order carelessly. Then he turned and walked away, without looking back at Evelyn. Not even a thank you. Not even a smile. Evelyn watched Mark's retreating figure. She felt a small, but real, emptiness. She had lived long enough to know better than to be so sensitive about such things. But tonight, her heart sank. Daniel saw it all. He stood up for the third time, and this time, he didn't sit back down right away. An elderly woman at a nearby table whispered, Hey, her son is about to stand up. David Miller whispered, He's not just a boy. I guess he's someone of some importance here. Rebecca nodded. The way he looked was the demeanor of someone in authority. Daniel was halfway toward Mark when another elderly guest, Mr. Thomas Grant, spoke softly to Marianne. I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen anything like this. Your staff doesn't seem right. The remark was just a normal suggestion. But when it echoed in the heavy silence, it became a loud drumbeat that struck the collective psychology. Marianne nodded, but her eyes were on Daniel. Daniel was standing still in the middle of the restaurant. His posture was calm, but commanding. Some of the regulars began to recognize him. One of them whispered, I think that guy is Daniel Carter. The person next to him was startled. Restaurant owner. Correct. Like a domino effect. Eyes began to shift from Mark to Daniel, then from Daniel to Evelyn, the puzzle piece they didn't understand, but was slowly being revealed. Mark was still oblivious. He was smiling and chatting with another table, as if everything was completely normal. Evelyn looked at her son standing in the middle of the restaurant. Her eyes were filled with love, but also worry. Don't worry about yourself. Worry about him. Daniel, her son, the one who had carried her pain into his life without a single complaint, was witnessing something he should not have witnessed. Evelyn placed her hand over her heart, gently, a gesture only those who have endured pain all their lives make. She thought to herself, Don't let me suffer this pain with you. But it was too late. Daniel took another step towards Mark. And at that moment, the room held its breath. Not because they knew what was coming, but because they feel that. Evelyn's silence had reached its limit. The atmosphere in the Silver Monarch felt like the moment before a storm descended on the streets of Seattle in December. No one said a word, but everyone felt something, as if the entire room's heartbeat slowed as one. Daniel Carter stood in the middle of the restaurant, his body straight, his eyes sharp but calm. He didn't need to say anything, just standing there. His silence was enough to make the nearest table stop eating and talking. Those who have met Daniel at fundraising meetings, speaking engagements with the Black startup community, or at Seattle charity events know one thing. Daniel has never used his power to intimidate anyone. His power is calm, his composure, and an aura that makes others see their own mistakes without him having to say much. But tonight, that calm was as taut as a steel wire. From a distance, Mark Harris remained oblivious. He returned to the bar to get the check for another table, smirking as he went. He glanced at Evelyn's table and muttered loudly enough for someone nearby to hear, I don't understand why people insist on coming here. There are more suitable restaurants. An elderly woman at the table on the right frowned. Hey, that's a rude statement. Mark shrugged. I just tell the truth. Mr. Thomas Grant put his glass down on the table. The sound was not loud, but decisive. You are not telling the truth. You are showing your true nature. The words traveled like a thunderbolt, and for the first time tonight, Mark paused. Daniel took 3 more steps, approaching the small counter in the middle of the hall. He did not walk quickly, but each step he took caused the air to shift like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into a pond. Marianne Young watched from near the kitchen. She knew Daniel was pushing the limits of his tolerance, but she also knew it wasn't his ego that was causing him this. It was the hurt of a son watching his mother be treated so badly. She walked closer to Daniel, her voice low, almost loud enough for only he to hear Daniel. I'll talk to him first. You don't need to. Daniel interrupted her with a slight shake of his head. Marianne, sometimes the silence of good people gives evil the permission to continue. The statement made Marianne choke, not because it was harsh, but because it was so true that it stung. Mark, who still thought Daniel was just a difficult customer, approached him, holding a few bills in his hand. What's the matter? He asked impatiently. I was busy serving other tables. Daniel looked straight at Mark, his eyes not angry, but calm as the surface of an icy lake. His voice was low and clear. Are you so busy that you don't see your guests? Mark laughed awkwardly. I see it all, but some people don't belong here, and I have to prioritize those who behave. Do you understand? A soft hiss sounded from several tables, not laughter, more of a gasp of disbelief. For the first time, Mark felt something was wrong, but he tried to keep his voice steady. If you are not satisfied, I can ask someone else. Daniel took a half step forward, just a half step, but it was enough to make the entire restaurant fall silent. Do you know who the woman at table number 12 is? Mark glanced at Evelyn's desk and shrugged. I don't care. All customers are the same, but some customers are better suited to this restaurant. Daniel took a deep breath. His hands clenched and unclenched quickly. He needed to control himself, not because he was afraid of losing his temper, but because he knew his mother wouldn't want to see her son acting rashly. Daniel spoke more slowly, more clearly, each word as if placed on the table. That is my mother. Mark stood still, his mouth open but no words coming out. A customer at the back table exclaimed softly, I knew it. I knew it. Daniel continued, his voice not loud, but everyone in the restaurant heard clearly. And I'm Daniel Carter, the owner of this restaurant. Mark took a step back, then another. He looked around as if searching for someone to rescue him, but everyone was looking at him. No sympathetic eyes. A vague feeling of dread began to well up in his chest. I don't know, he stammered. Daniel replied, Right. You don't know. You don't know who she is. You don't know her story. You don't know her struggles, her kindness. But you think you have the right to decide a person's worth based on their looks and your prejudices. Mark swallowed. His face was starting to redden with embarrassment. Daniel adjusted his collar and continued, If she weren't my mother today, if she were just a normal woman, would you have treated her differently? Mark froze. Unable to answer, Daniel added, That's the problem. The room was silent. Evelyn looked at her son. There was a slight sadness in her eyes, mixed with pride. Daniel was defending her, but in the right way. No noise, no bitterness, just truth and dignity. Marianne stepped forward, her voice stern. Mark, I need you to come to the staff area right now. Mark tried to open his mouth. I didn't mean to. I just thought. Evelyn suddenly stood up, all eyes on her. She spoke in a soft voice, as light as a breath, but clear. No one knows everyone's story, but that doesn't mean we can't be kind. Mark bowed his head. Evelyn stepped closer to him, gently, not angry, not insulting. She said, You didn't hurt me by your actions, but you hurt yourself by forgetting that respect has nothing to do with position or power. Mark couldn't lift his head. It seemed like his chest was so heavy that it was difficult to breathe. Daniel looked at his mother. A deep pity welled up in him. Evelyn never used her power to retaliate. She used kindness to teach people lessons they sometimes never learned in their entire lives. Marianne put her hand on Mark's shoulder. Let's go. As Mark turned away, several guests breathed a sigh of relief. A lighter atmosphere gradually returned. Daniel helped his mother sit down again. He asked, Are you okay? Mom Evelyn smiled. I'm fine. Daniel, stay calm. That's what makes me feel good. Daniel took her hand. It was shaking. Not because he was afraid, but because of the pain of seeing his mother degraded in the dining room he had built. Evelyn looked at him and whispered, You stood up at the right time. But remember, not to fight, but to remind people that humans deserve respect. Daniel nodded slightly. And that was the moment, right here at the Silver Monarch. Everyone understood that they were witnessing more than just a case of discrimination tonight. They witnessed a family, a lesson, an awakening. As Mark left the main lobby, The door to the staff area closed behind him with a heavy, full-stopping sound. But inside the Silver Monarch, things weren't over. The atmosphere was still in shock, as if everyone had just witnessed something they never thought they would see in a fancy restaurant in the middle of Seattle. Marianne Young stood still for a few seconds. She wasn't just shocked by Mark's behavior. She was shocked that she hadn't noticed the problem sooner. Her silence, for a seasoned manager, was a self-reproach. She looked at Daniel and Evelyn, but her gaze lingered longer on Evelyn, a gentle, older woman who had never frowned or said a harsh word during the long minutes of neglect and contempt. Marianne felt her chest tighten. She felt ashamed for the team. Daniel realized that. He stepped closer to Marianne. "Marianne, it's not your fault alone." She swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. "Daniel, I should have seen it sooner. I should have intervened before it got this far." Daniel shook his head very slightly. "No one can predict everything. The important thing is that we don't let it happen again." The simple statement made Marianne gasp. She didn't cry, but her eyes were warm, as if pride and shame had collided for a moment. A few tables away, longtime patrons began to converse quietly, not gossip. They spoke as if they were reflecting on how they lived each day. Mr. Thomas Grant slowly sipped his wine and whispered to his friend, "It's strange. We eat for so many years, but forget that there are pains that cannot be heard." The friend nodded. "I think tonight I learned something I've been ignoring for too long. At Rebecca and David Miller's table." Rebecca looked in the direction Daniel was standing and said, "Honestly, the first time I met her, I knew she was special." It's true that sometimes, just by looking at the way someone sits, you can tell they've been through a lot. David nodded, his voice low, "And I know nothing about them, but I still judge." The words echoed softly, but like a drop of water falling into a glass, causing many people nearby to suddenly fall silent. Evelyn sat still. Her hands were on the table, slightly overlapping. No shaking, no anger, just a deep calm that made others feel lighter. Daniel turned to her. "I'm sorry for putting you through this." Evelyn took her son's hand, hers warm and firm. "Daniel, I've been through much worse. What hurts me isn't his disrespect. It's that you had to witness it and hurt with me." Daniel bowed his head, closing his eyes for a moment. Evelyn knew that old memories were coming back to him, the years when they faced discrimination in stores, schools, and community meetings, the times Daniel was looked at with suspicion because of the color of his skin, and she could not forget the look in her son's eyes when he asked Mom, "Why did they do this to us tonight?" That look returned to the man standing before her. Only he was older, stronger, but still had the look of pain when he saw his mother being treated unfairly. Evelyn gently placed her hand on her child's cheek. "You don't need to apologize. You stood up for yourself. A grown man, a good man, is someone who stands up for what's right when it's threatened." Daniel looked up. His gaze was calm again, but deeper, more determined. In the bar area, Chris Jacobs remained silent. Since the beginning of dinner, he was the only one who saw the whole scene, but did not dare to intervene. Chris walked over to Daniel with a look of concern. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I could see Mark was being unreasonable. But I was afraid of doing the wrong thing, afraid of being seen as meddling in management matters." Daniel turned around and looked at Chris like he was looking at a real colleague, not a subordinate. "No one blames you. What's important is that you realize it." Chris took a deep breath, then added, "I just want to say, tonight I learned something that a month of training couldn't teach me." Daniel put his hand on Chris's shoulder, gently. Not everyone is brave at first, but when the heart knows what is right, it will lead the way. And that is what this restaurant needed. Those words made Chris stand up straighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. From behind, Marianne approached Daniel. "Let me call the kitchen to prepare Mrs. Evelyn's food right away. I want to make sure everything is perfect." Evelyn smiled. "No need to be perfect, Marianne. Just be sincere." She nodded. "Yeah, but I have to do better tonight." Then she turned to the staff, her voice loud but warm. Let's start over. People. Tonight we serve with our hearts, not because the boss is here, but because we need to be better people. Some of the young employees nodded. Others sighed in regret. For a long time, they had only considered work as a duty. They had forgotten that behind each chair was a living human story. As Mary Ann was about to return to the kitchen, Evelyn called softly, "Mary Ann." She stopped. "Thank you for standing up for what is right." Mary Ann was surprised, then bowed her head. "I should have come earlier," Evelyn replied. "The important thing is that she chose right, no matter what the time." The words were like a warm stream running through Mary Ann's chest. She turned away with red eyes, but a lighter heart. Meanwhile, Daniel sat down next to his mother, but his eyes kept glancing toward the employee door where Mark had disappeared. He wasn't looking because he was angry. He was looking because he was thoughtful, because he had a responsibility, because he understood. Something like tonight didn't just come from one employee. It came from a dark part of the system that he, as the owner, needed to shine a light on. Evelyn put her hand on her son's arm. "What are you thinking?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I think we need to look at everything. Mom, not just Mark. I don't want our restaurant to be the place where someone has to cower to be treated well." Evelyn nodded slightly. "So this is an opportunity, not a shame, a chance to do better." Daniel was silent, and then he understood. Tonight is not a failure. Tonight is a ray of light. After Mary Ann left for the kitchen, the Silver Monarch became strangely quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of before, but the quiet of a place looking back at itself. Soft yellow lights cast a warmer feeling on the dining tables, as if the room itself were breathing a sigh of relief after a strong wind. But for Daniel, that wind has not yet passed. He sat next to his mother, but his eyes were fixed on the empty space in front of him, where Mark had stood, where, minutes before, he had been confronted with what he had always tried to avoid, the hurt of a son when his mother was insulted. Evelyn looked at her son, knowing what was stirring inside him. Evelyn said softly, "Daniel, don't let the darkness of today overshadow the light you have created all these years." Daniel smiled slightly, but it wasn't a comfortable smile. It was more like a breath trying to hide the heaviness in his chest. "I'm just thinking back," Evelyn asked. "Think back to what?" Daniel was silent for a few seconds before answering. "About the past, Mom. About things I thought I had overcome, but turned out were still inside me." Evelyn was silent. She knew Daniel didn't say it easily. His kindness always made others think he was strong and unscathed. But the truth was, those scars were hidden deep inside, and it was only when he saw someone hurt his mother that he couldn't help himself. Evelyn said softly, "Daniel, you are still human. There are wounds, even though they have healed, still hurt when someone touches them." Daniel didn't look at his mother. He looked down at the table. His hands rested on his knees, light but firm. "Mom, do you remember? When I was 12, Evelyn smiled sadly. How can I forget?" Daniel took a deep breath. It was long, heavy, filled with memory. I remember it clearly. It was cold in Seattle that year. One evening, my mother took me to a Mexican restaurant on the corner of Pike Street. I loved tacos that day. Remember? Evelyn nodded slightly. She remembered every detail of that evening. But when they entered the shop, the owner looked them up and down and said no tables were available. No tables. He wouldn't even let them wait. Daniel continued. I saw behind him. There were 3 empty tables. Evelyn placed her hand on her son's and held it tightly. It was a memory Daniel had never fully told. Evelyn had taken her son outside that day, smiled slightly, and said, "It's okay. Daniel, we'll find another place." But Daniel understood. Children may not fully understand the meaning of discrimination, but they sense it when adults are looked down upon. Daniel continued in a low voice, "I see you trying to smile. You always do, even when you're in pain." Evelyn replied, "Mom has to smile, because if Mom cries, it will hurt me more." Daniel turned his face away, as if wanting to hide the trembling in his eyes. "But you know what? I made a promise to myself that day." Evelyn asked softly, "What is it, son?" "That one day, I will build a place where no one is treated like you and I were then." Evelyn held her breath. Her heart sank and melted into warm light. "So when I opened the Silver Monarch, I wanted it to be a place where people felt valued, heard, seen, no matter who they were." Evelyn squeezed her son's hand gently, her eyes filled with pride as she looked at him. "You did it, Daniel. You really did it?" Daniel was silent. The silence was not because of sadness, but because too many emotions were building up. "But tonight, I was sitting right in the place you worked so hard to build, and being treated like this." His voice trembled slightly, for the first time all evening, and I felt helpless. "I wanted to protect you, but I didn't want to bother you. I didn't want to make a fuss." Evelyn smiled gently. "Daniel, you don't have to protect me from the world. I've lived long enough to know that there are people who don't understand people. But what you're doing isn't protecting me. It's protecting your own kindness." Daniel looked up, looking straight into his mother's eyes that had been through so much, but had never lost their gentleness. Suddenly, from the table on the left, "Mr. Thomas Grant stood up. He slowly walked to Evelyn and Daniel's table. The whole restaurant's eyes followed his every step. As he approached, he spoke in a low but respectful voice. "Mrs. Carter, I want to tell you something. I feel like I've learned a great lesson today, not just from you, but from your son." Evelyn was surprised, but she smiled very slightly. "Thank you," Thomas continued. "You know, I'm 65 years old, and I'm not sure I've ever had the composure you had tonight in my life. I want to thank you for reminding us that civility is not a privilege. It's a duty." Many other guests nodded slightly. A middle-aged woman said, "I've never seen anyone as calm as you in a situation like that. I don't think I could do it." Daniel looked around. He didn't want the evening to be a pity party, but these words weren't for sympathy. They were for respect. Evelyn nodded slightly and replied modestly, "I am just a mother. I don't want my son to see me angry. I want him to see how to use his heart to overcome harsh things." Daniel almost wanted to laugh because that was so true of his mother. Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for sharing. And thank you, Carter, for teaching us what many forget respect is the foundation of any community." Then he turned back to the table, but his words were not left to Daniel or Evelyn alone. They lingered with everyone. And that was the moment the Silver Monarch became warmer, not because of the lights, but because of the people. Mary Ann returned from the kitchen with a slight smile. "Mrs. Evelyn, the food is almost here. We prepared it with great care today." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, Mary Ann." Daniel looked at his mother, then at everyone else, and realized something. A restaurant is about more than food. It's about people. And tonight, that lesson was more evident than ever. As the food began to arrive, the atmosphere in the Silver Monarch gradually shifted to a new rhythm. It was not the bustling atmosphere from before, nor the tension that had just subsided. It was a rhythm of reflection, of listening, and of growing up. Mary Ann appeared at Evelyn's table with a large tray. On it lay cedar-grilled salmon, its pale pink flesh glistening under a light lemon butter, accompanied by roasted vegetables that were just cooked, all presented elegantly. Mary Ann bowed slightly. "Miss Evelyn, here is the salmon you chose. The chef has remade it twice to make sure it's perfect." Evelyn smiled. "Thanks. It looks great." Daniel also looked at the food and nodded slightly to Mary Ann. "Thank you for your care," Mary Ann replied softly. "That's what we should have done from the beginning." The way Mary Ann said it made one thing clear to Daniel. Genuine humility isn't about making a fuss about apologizing. It comes from accepting responsibility and making amends through action. As Mary Ann left, Evelyn took a spoon and cut off a small piece of salmon. She tasted it, her eyes softening. "This dish is delicious." Daniel smiled. "I'm glad you like it, Mom." But something was still unsettling in his eyes. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Evelyn said, "Do you still think about Mark?" Daniel did not dodge part of it. "But there's more." Evelyn put down her spoon. "Tell me, Mom." Daniel leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. "You know, Mom, The Silver Monarch is where I put all my heart and soul, not just because of my dream, but because I want to create a place for those who have stood outside the boundaries of fairness, a place where no one has to doubt their worth. Evelyn listened, her eyes never leaving Daniel for a second. Daniel continued, "But tonight, I realized something scary, that even the place you build with all the best values can sometimes be overshadowed by someone who simply doesn't understand what kindness is." Evelyn thought for a moment and then asked, "Do you think that is wrong?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Not wrong, but I feel lost, like I let the darkness in without knowing it." Evelyn put her hand on her son's hand. "Daniel, darkness is not something one can completely control. You can only teach those in the darkness to understand the light, but whether they walk towards the light or not is their own choice." Daniel looked at his mother. Those words were like a warm stream flowing through his heavy thoughts. From the table behind, a voice rang out softly. Carter Daniel turned around. It was Rebecca Miller, the young woman who had been watching from the beginning. She and her husband approached politely. Rebecca said, "I just wanted to say, you handled things very nicely tonight. Not many people can stay that calm when their loved ones are being treated badly." David added, "Yes, if it were me, I probably wouldn't be able to keep my cool like you." Daniel replied gently, "Thanks, both of you. But I didn't do it to prove anything. I just did what I think anyone should do when they see something wrong." Rebecca looked at Evelyn and said, "Madam, your composure really touched me. I learned a lot from the way you held yourself tonight." Evelyn smiled slightly. "Thank you. Sometimes silence is the most powerful voice." After the couple returned to the table, Evelyn turned to Daniel. "See, we never know who our light will touch, even in the most unexpected moment." Daniel looked at his mother, but this time his eyes were softer. A moment later, when dessert was served, the atmosphere became even warmer. Small lemon tarts were placed before Evelyn. The light scent of lemon peel mixed with the scent of butter softened the air. Evelyn cut off a small slice and brought it to her mouth. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if savoring the moment more than the food. Daniel asked, "Do you like it?" Mom Evelyn smiled. "Yeah, it's delicious. But what I like more is the atmosphere right now." See, Daniel looked around. Tables of customers who had previously focused only on their meals now looked at each other more, talked more, even smiled at strangers. A few young waiters tended to the tables with a completely different attitude, gentler, more proactive. Daniel was silent for a moment and then said, "Mom was right. The restaurant changed." Evelyn nodded. "It's not just restaurants. People change too. It's moments like tonight that make people realize they should be living better." Daniel bowed his head slightly, thinking deeply. Evelyn looked at her son and said, "Daniel, remember, no place is perfect. What matters is that you dare to fix it, dare to face it, and dare to try again." Daniel replied, "Mom always sees the good in everyone." Evelyn smiled gently. "If I hadn't seen, my son wouldn't have grown up to be this kind of person." Daniel chuckled softly. For the first time all evening, from a distance, Chris Jacobs was wiping glasses at the bar, watching them. He saw Daniel smile and smiled softly back, as if he could feel the healing spreading through him. No one said a word to each other, but everyone understood. Tonight was more than an incident. It was a turning point, a touch point, a reminder that kindness, when done right, can change a room. The Silver Monarch, once the glitz of an expensive restaurant, now has a deeper meaning. It became a place where the heart was served before the food, as dinner neared its end. The Silver Monarch fell into a special kind of silence. Not an empty silence, but the silence that comes after a heart has experienced something profound. Everyone in the restaurant had calmed down, but they still kept their attention on Evelyn and Daniel, trying to act natural. Daniel sat there, watching his mother enjoy dessert, but his face still held a brooding look. He had yet to tell her something important, something that had been bothering him. Evelyn noticed the small change immediately. "Daniel, is there anything you haven't told me?" Daniel glanced up. His eyes wavered. Evelyn had lived long enough to know what that look meant. Her son was debating whether to say it or not. Daniel slowly put down the spoon, leaning slightly towards his mother. "Mom, I have to say this. I don't want you to hear it from anyone else." Evelyn waited silently. Daniel took a slow breath, then said, "Mark is not new. He has been warned 3 times about discriminatory behavior in the past, and tonight was the last straw." Evelyn paused for a second. She wasn't shocked, but clearly unhappy. "Do you know?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I know, and that's why I was conflicted. I tried to give him a chance, because I believe anyone can change if guided. But I was wrong." Evelyn did not blame. She simply closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if sorting through her emotions. Daniel continued, "I want everyone to have a chance to be better, but not everyone is willing to step out of their own shadow." Evelyn said softly, "Son, it's never wrong to give someone a chance, but if someone rejects that chance, you have to know when to stop." Daniel looked at his mother, sensing the kindness and understanding in her words. Evelyn didn't demand perfection. She only wanted her son to maintain the kindness he had cultivated all his life. But then, a voice from behind made them both turn around. It was Mark, standing right at the kitchen door. His face no longer held the defiant look it had before. It was pale, tense, a little remorseful, but not yet truly remorseful. A kitchen staff member had probably told him who Daniel was, the owner of the restaurant, whose mother he had just insulted. Mark took a few steps closer to their table. No one said anything. The whole restaurant was silent, as if waiting to see what he would do. Mark swallowed. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize." Daniel did not answer immediately, and Evelyn merely watched him, not angrily, not contemptuously, just a disorienting calm. Mark continued, "Didn't know she was your mother, and I didn't know." Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but stern. "What if my mother isn't my mother? What if she's just a regular visitor?" Mark stood still. Daniel looked deeply at him. Respect is not something that depends on the status of others. It depends on your own character. The whole restaurant fell silent. Mark lowered his gaze, his shoulders shaking slightly. For the first time tonight, he seemed to truly realize the extent of his mistake. I don't think," Mark stammered. Daniel said, "I don't think, that's the problem." A gentle but sharp sentence, strong enough to make Mark look back at the whole way he treats people. Evelyn spoke now. Her voice was soft, as if to ease the tension in the room. "Mark, I don't hate you, but your behavior tonight made me think maybe you've forgotten that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness." Mark raised his head and looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were not reproachful. On the contrary, they made him examine himself. Evelyn continued, "People make mistakes, but what makes them great is how they get back up after those mistakes." Mark took a deep breath. He looked at Daniel, whom he had thought was just a casual-dressed customer, and bowed deeply to both of them. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. And, if you'll allow me, I'd like to make it right." Daniel was silent for a moment. He didn't like the rush. He needed to make sure this wasn't an apology for fear of losing his job. Daniel asked, "Are you sorry because you're afraid of losing your job, or because you realize you're wrong?" Mark looked down at the ground, his eyes slightly red. I don't know, but I feel ashamed. And I want to change. I really do." Daniel looked at him long enough to judge the sincerity in his words. Daniel said, "I can't decide right now. Go home tonight. Think about it. Then come back tomorrow. Not to ask for your job, but to show me the person you want to be." Mark nodded vigorously. He turned and walked into the staff room. But before the door closed, Daniel saw Mark's shoulders slump, as if he were carrying a burden he never realized he was carrying. When he left, Evelyn turned to Daniel, her eyes softening. "You did the right thing. It didn't start with forgiveness, nor did it end with a slamming door. You gave people a chance, but a chance they had to choose." Daniel bowed his head slightly, as if receiving confirmation from the heart he trusted most. "Mom, I just want this restaurant to be a place where people learn to treat each other well." Evelyn smiled gently. "And tonight, I taught a lesson that will be remembered for a long time." Daniel looked around the restaurant for a moment. No one said anything loudly, but all the customers looked at him with a new respect. They saw more than just a restaurant owner. They saw a true leader, someone who knows how to stand up, but but not to put others down. Someone who knows how to keep boundaries, but not to close people's hearts. Someone who inherits strength from experience and depth from the mother sitting next to him. In that moment, Daniel understood. The night was not over yet. The knot had only just been untied, and behind it were many things to face. When the Silver Monarch closed that night, it was almost 11 p.m. Seattle outside was chilly and humid, and inside the restaurant, the only light left was a small yellow glow from the wall lamps, enough to dispel the silence, but still maintain the feeling of gravity that was creeping in. Daniel decided not to let this go unnoticed. He needed a meeting with the management team immediately. Not to yell, not to place blame, but to really understand what had caused the system to go so wrong that this had happened today. Mary Ann Young, the night shift manager, was sorting through paperwork in the staff office when she heard Daniel calling her name. "Mary Ann, we have a meeting now. Call Chris and the 2 assistant managers into the small conference room." Mary Ann was slightly startled, but her face remained solemn. She knew that Daniel would never call a meeting in the middle of the night unless it was absolutely essential. "Yes, I will call everyone." Less than 5 minutes later, 4 people were sitting around a long wooden table in a small conference room. The air was so quiet that the ticking of the second hand on the clock could be heard clearly. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped together in front of his chest, his face still calm, but his eyes sharp, as if looking at the essence of the problem. Daniel spoke first, his voice slow and clear. "Tonight, something happened that was unacceptable. Not just Mark's behavior toward my mother, but the way the entire system allowed it to go on for almost an hour without anyone intervening. I want to hear the truth. From everyone." The atmosphere in the room became heavier. Mary Ann spoke first, her voice low but sincere. "Daniel, I've seen some of Mark's behavior before. Not as bad as tonight, but enough that I get the feeling he's biased against older or less well-dressed guests. I've pointed it out, but maybe not strongly enough." Daniel asked immediately, "Why not report back to me?" Mary Ann lowered her eyes, "I think. I can handle it myself. I don't want to put pressure on you while you're preparing for next week's fundraising event." Daniel was silent for a few seconds. The atmosphere was getting more and more tense. Then he turned to Chris Jacobs, the young employee who had observed almost the entire event tonight. "Chris, what about you? What did you see?" Chris hesitated a bit, but then said, I saw Mark pass Mrs. Carter's table 3 times, and I saw the disapproving looks from the customers. I should have told Mary Ann or you right away." Daniel looked at him, not angry, but serious. "So why not?" Chris took a deep breath, his hands clenched. "I'm scared. It's crowded tonight. I've only just started. I'm scared of being told I'm intruding. I'm scared of doing something wrong. I'm scared of people thinking I'm causing trouble." That answer made Daniel look at Chris for a moment longer. Not out of disappointment, but because he understood that the fear was not Chris's alone. It's a fear that many young employees in the service industry have: fear of overstepping boundaries, fear of being told they're overstepping their authority, fear of being blamed. Daniel sighed, then said, "You know what? Chris, a healthy system is one where employees aren't afraid to say what's right. If a young employee doesn't feel safe enough to speak up, that's my fault as a leader." Chris bowed his head, but his eyes held a hint of relief. Daniel's words didn't make him feel more guilty. They made him feel acknowledged. Mary Ann continued, "Daniel, I take a lot of responsibility for this. I was running the night shift, and I let things get out of control." Daniel looked at her, then shook his head. "I'm not here to find blame. I'm here to find the cause and make it better. Mark is just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is that we haven't built enough safe environments where anyone can say, 'This isn't right,' without fear of repercussions." The whole room was silent. Daniel stood up, walked to the whiteboard, and picked up a pen. He wrote 3 big words: respect, courage, empathy. Then turn around. These are the core values of the restaurant. But tonight, we lost 2: compassion and courage. He looked at each person: compassion, to see someone being treated unfairly; courage, to stand up and say, "Stop." Mary Ann nodded slightly. Chris sighed, as if realizing something he had never thought of before. Daniel said again, "Starting tomorrow, I'm changing the process. We're adding a new rule. Any employee can request a review if they see discrimination. They don't have to be a manager. They don't have to ask. Just say something if they see something wrong. The whole room looked at Daniel, clearly surprised, but also respectful. Daniel continued, and I want everyone to understand. If it wasn't my mother who was being treated badly tonight, I would still do the same thing. Because the reputation of this restaurant isn't based on the lights, the menu, or the decor. It's based on how we treat every single person who walks through these doors. No one said anything. Marianne just placed her hand lightly on the table as a silent pledge. After a moment, Daniel put his pen down on the table and said, his voice softer, "We have one more thing to do. Tomorrow, I'll see Mark again, and depending on his attitude, I'll decide. But I want to be clear. Correction is an opportunity, not a privilege," Chris asked softly. "So what if he really changes?" Daniel looked at him, his eyes both serious and full of hope. "Then we have one more person who learns the most important lesson of his life. Or else, he will have to leave." The meeting ended a few minutes later. As everyone left the room, Daniel remained standing, looking at the whiteboard. Respect, courage, empathy. Those three seemingly simple words tonight became a challenge for the whole team. Daniel stood alone in the conference room for a long time. He knew the story did not end there. It had just begun a new chapter. And tomorrow will be the day when everything needs to be put back in its place. The next Seattle morning brought a cold silver light, sliding through the large glass panels of the Silver Monarch. The restaurant was still closed for a few hours, but inside, the lights were on. The morning cleaners worked softly, as if afraid to disturb the silence before the wind of change. Daniel arrived earlier than usual. He always did when he had something to face. His dark suit wasn't too formal, but it was enough to show that he wanted things to be serious. He walked through the door, nodded to the cleaner, and headed straight for the small conference room. Evelyn Carter arrived early, too. She wore a dark blue woolen shawl, her hair tied back. She didn't have to be there, but she wanted to. Not because of the hurt of the night before, but because she wanted to see her son handle things with dignity. Daniel saw his mother standing near the kitchen, looking around the restaurant with calm eyes. "You came early. Mom, I thought you would rest more." Evelyn smiled. "Important things should be attended. Today is not your business alone." Daniel was neither happy nor sad. He just nodded. He knew his mother wasn't there to intervene. She was there to lift his spirits in the gentlest way possible. Around 8 o'clock, Marianne Young walked in. She bowed to Evelyn and then looked at Daniel. "Mark said he would be on time. It seems he has been thinking a lot." Daniel replied, "Okay, we'll hear him out, but the verdict will be on his attitude, not his promises." A moment later, the door opened. Mark Harris appears. He wasn't wearing his usual waiter uniform. Today, Mark wore a simple gray shirt that looked like it had been ironed in a hurry. His hair was a little messy, and his eyes were slightly sunken, like someone who hadn't slept well. Mark saw Daniel and stopped. Then he looked at Evelyn, hesitant as if he was afraid to come closer. But after a few seconds, Mark took a deep breath and walked into the conference room. Daniel sat down in the chair and gestured, "Please sit down." Mark sat across from me. He placed his hands on his thighs, palms down, as if to hold back some of the trembling. Daniel spoke first. "I made it clear yesterday you didn't come here to ask for a job, but to show me the person you've decided to become. So, what do you want to say?" Mark swallowed. He didn't look at Daniel right away, but looked down at the table, as if he didn't know where to start. Finally, Mark said, his voice breaking a little, "Last night, I came home and sat in the living room for 2 hours without turning on the lights. I don't know why I did it, but I think I needed to face myself." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, listening. Mark continued. "Around midnight, I called my sister. She was a high school teacher. She yelled at me, not because she was afraid I would lose my job, but because I was doing something that went against the values she tries to teach her students every day. I had never seen her so angry." Mark looked up a bit, looked into Daniel's eyes, then looked back down. "I thought for a long time, and I realized I wasn't just insulting Mrs. Carter because I was prejudiced or tired. I was insulting other people, because there was a part of me that I didn't want to admit I thought I had the right to judge people's worth based on their appearance. The whole room fell into complete silence. Mark continued, his voice slower but deeper. I was wrong. I was fundamentally wrong. Not just in my actions, but in my thoughts. Last night, when Mrs. Carter looked at me, she didn't say anything, but I saw the disappointment, and I was ashamed, really ashamed. Evelyn looked at Mark gently. She didn't nod or shake her head. She just listened. Mark took another breath, then looked up, his eyes slightly red. I don't know if you still want me here. I'm not even sure I deserve to, but I want to make it right. Not for work, but because I want to look back on myself and not regret it like I did last night. Daniel kept his expression calm, but inside, he knew Mark's words were not simply an excuse. They had the heaviness of someone who had thought long and hard. Daniel asked, "Can you tell me what made you realize you were really wrong?" Mark closed his eyes for a second. When I realized, if my mother was treated like that, I wouldn't be able to stand it. I would want someone to stand up for her. But last night, I was the one who did it to someone else's mother. Mark's voice choked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He was silent for a long time, long enough for Mark to feel his heart stop. Then Daniel spoke up. "Mark, I don't believe an apology changes a person. What changes a person is the action after the apology." Mark looked at Daniel, waiting. Daniel said slowly, "I'll give you one more chance. One last chance. But you won't be returning to server right away. For the next 2 weeks, you'll be taking an internal training course on customer service and dealing with unconscious bias. You'll be working under Marianne's direct supervision. And after 2 weeks, I'll reevaluate." Mark was a little surprised. It seemed he didn't expect there to be a real chance. Daniel continued, "But if there is even the slightest sign of you repeating the same behavior, I will terminate the contract immediately. No delay, no compromise." "Do you understand?" Mark nodded quickly, his eyes redder. "I understand. And I thank you. Thank you for not closing the door on my future immediately." Evelyn then spoke. It was soft, but resonant as a little bell, Mark. Remember, making amends isn't about doing things over again to please others. Making amends is about reinventing yourself. If you can truly do that, yesterday will become a lesson, not a wound. Mark bowed deeply to Evelyn. "Thank you. Thank you very much." Daniel stood up and held out his hand. "I hope to see a different Mark. A better Mark." Mark shook his hand, for the first time without resentment, without pride, only humility. When Mark left the conference room, Marianne breathed a sigh of relief. Chris was at the door. Having heard the last part, he looked at Daniel differently with both respect and inquiry. Evelyn looked at her son and whispered, "You did the right thing." Daniel replied, "I just hope I don't judge people wrongly." Evelyn put her hand on his shoulder. "Everyone has the right to choose a new path, if they truly want to take it." Daniel smiled slightly, but in his heart he understood one thing clearly. This story isn't over yet. It's just coming full circle. And sometimes, the most important thing isn't the punishment, it's the change. That afternoon, when the Silver Monarch opened its doors to customers, the atmosphere inside the restaurant was different from usual. There was something heavy and profound, as if every employee had some unspoken thought. Marianne Young, who was the night shift manager but had arrived early to help Daniel, sensed the change. The staff who passed her no longer chatted and laughed freely. They whispered, glanced toward the conference room, then fell silent again when they saw Daniel in the distance. No one spoke loudly. No one made a clear statement. But the silence was enough for Daniel to understand the story between Mark and Evelyn had become the topic of discussion throughout the entire team. Chris Jacobs, the young employee, was the first person who dared to approach Daniel while he was standing in the bar area. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" Daniel turned back. His voice was soft. "Just ask." Chris licked his lips as if trying to organize his words. Was Mark really given a chance to make things right? Daniel replied, "Yes. I made it clear to him, and that decision is unchanged." Chris bowed his head, his voice low. "I'm just afraid people won't like it." Daniel looked at him, waiting for the next sentence. Chris whispered, "Some people think he's too lenient, especially those who have been yelled at or mistreated by Mark." Daniel was not surprised. He had expected this reaction. He asked, "And you? What do you think?" Chris sighed. "I think you did the right thing. But I'm also afraid it might seem unfair to some people." Daniel placed his hand lightly on Chris's shoulder. "Thanks for being honest. I'll take care of the rest." Chris nodded slightly and left, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the noisy space, still clearly hearing his heartbeat. That afternoon, as the customers began to pour in, Daniel noticed the different looks among the staff. There was admiration, there was wonder, there was concern, and there were even disapproving glances toward the staff lounge, where Mark was attending his first training session led by Mary Ann. But the most surprising thing happened around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. While Daniel was reviewing the import invoice, Mary Ann ran over. "Daniel, I need to go to the kitchen for a bit." Her voice wasn't panicked, but serious enough for him to know he had to go. Daniel walked down to the kitchen and saw 3 staff members standing together, looking nervous. Thomas Grant, the elderly customer who had come by last night to make a reservation for next week's party, was standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking around with an annoyed look. Thomas said, his voice low and clear, "Mr. Carter, I have something to say." Daniel walked over, his hands still calm. "Yes, I'm listening." Thomas looked straight. "I saw what happened last night, and I came back today for a clear reason. I want to know, why is an employee like Mark still working here?" A few of the staff fell silent, taking a few steps back to listen without being noticed. Daniel could feel the pressure building up, but his face remained unchanged. Daniel replied, "Mr. Grant, I decided to give Mark a chance to make amends after our conversation this morning. However, it is not an unconditional forgiveness. He is on a strict supervision program. If he commits a repeat offense, he will leave immediately." Thomas folded his arms. "I understand, but I also want you to know, if Mrs. Carter wasn't your mother, would you have done it?" A straight as an arrow question. The whole kitchen held its breath. Daniel looked straight at Thomas. "If it wasn't my mother who was mistreated last night, I would still do the same thing. Because before I was my mother's son, I was the owner of this place, and I don't tolerate any discrimination here." Thomas watched him for a few seconds. Then he breathed slowly, as if testing the veracity of Daniel's words. Evelyn appeared at that moment, a cup of tea in her hand from the bar. She approached, but did not interrupt. Thomas saw Evelyn and bowed slightly. "Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry about what you went through last night." Evelyn smiled kindly. "It's okay. Mr. Grant, what matters is how people react after it. My son did the right thing." Thomas turned back to Daniel. His gaze was less harsh. "Okay, if Mrs. Carter believes, I believe too. I hope your decision will bring good results." Then he left the kitchen, leaving his secretary to set the party on schedule. As soon as he left, a young employee whispered to the person next to him, "I didn't expect the boss to keep Mark for real." Daniel heard. He didn't turn around, just said, "I don't hold anyone back. I give them chances. But chances are only valuable when the recipient knows how to appreciate them." All was silent. That afternoon, Mark walked out of his first training session. He looked tired, but his eyes were no longer as lost as they had been in the morning. When he saw Daniel standing in the hallway, Mark walked over. "Mr. Carter, thank you for today's training. I never thought I would have to learn how to behave properly like this, but I realized I have forgotten so many things." Daniel asked, "How do you feel?" Mark hesitated. "Honestly, I feel small," Daniel replied. "It is a sign of a person starting to change." Mark smiled a tiny smile, a mixture of hope and confusion. He nodded and left. Daniel stood there for a moment, clearly sensing the shift in the air. Each person was changing or about to change, like small stones dropped into water, creating ripples that spread out. In the evening, when the last customers left, Mary Ann sat at the bar with Daniel. "You know, the whole team is looking at you differently," Daniel asked. "How is it different?" Mary Ann smiled slightly. They are learning to be strong, but not harsh. Strict, but still humane. They are learning from him, not just following him. Daniel was silent for a moment. It wasn't an empty compliment. It was the truth, a truth that weighed heavily on his shoulders, but also filled him with hope. Evelyn came out of the kitchen, put on her coat, and prepared to leave. She looked at her son and said, "To lead a restaurant, you have to understand that you are leading people's hearts, not just their shifts." Daniel nodded. "You know, Mom, sometimes I'm afraid I'm wrong." Evelyn touched his hand. "Fear of making mistakes is a sign of a responsible person. Those who are never afraid of making mistakes are the ones to worry about." Daniel chuckled, and in that moment, he knew tomorrow would be full of storms. But the wind is not to avoid. The wind is to know how strong you can stand. That night, Seattle was windier than usual. The wind from Elliott Bay blew down the streets, making the streetlights sway as if they were about to go out. The Silver Monarch closed at 10, but Daniel remained, sitting alone at a corner table by the glass door. There was no more sound of dishes, no more sound of guests chatting. There was only the sound of strong wind hitting the thin glass, creating a dull sound that made the room less peaceful, but added to the depth of thought. Daniel looked out onto the street, swirling a glass of water that had almost melted ice. Everything that had happened in the past 2 days was coming back to him like a wave upon wave, relentless. Even though he had handled things properly, even though he had been praised, even though Mark had sincerely repented, there was still something unsettled in his heart. He wondered, was he leading with his heart, or was he being carried away by his emotions? Was his decision to give Mark a chance truly fair to the employees who had suffered under him? And most importantly, was his mother more hurt than she let on? The sound of light footsteps echoed behind. "Daniel, you're not home yet." It was Evelyn. She had returned because she had forgotten her purse. But when she saw her son sitting in the dim light, she knew at once that he was not here for any small matter. Daniel looked up and smiled slightly. "Mom, are you not sleeping?" Evelyn pulled a chair and sat opposite. "Can't sleep. The wind is too strong. How about you?" Daniel slowly put the glass down on the table. "I'm thinking about something." Evelyn didn't ask further. She knew Daniel would only speak when he was ready. After about half a minute of silence, Daniel took a deep breath. "Mom, I'm afraid I made a mistake in giving Mark a chance." Evelyn looked straight into his eyes, her eyes gentle but very alert. "Why?" Daniel replied. "Because I could see the other employees. They were unhappy, not because they hated Mark, but because they were afraid I would tolerate his wrongdoings, just because he apologized." Evelyn listened to every word. Daniel continued, "I always believe that people can change. But what if I was wrong this time? If I let the wrong person stay, would that make the good people feel betrayed?" Evelyn placed her hand on her son's, her hand warmer than the dim yellow light Daniel. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean doing the easy thing, nor does it mean doing what the majority supports. Daniel sighed, "But I'm afraid of losing their trust." Evelyn smiled gently. "You don't prove yourself right by getting approval. You prove yourself by standing firm in your values." Daniel was silent, a deep silence. Outside the window, the wind blew like waves crashing against the side of a boat. Evelyn looked at her son for a long time, and then said in a low but gentle voice, "Son, you do what not everyone has the courage to do. You allow others to make mistakes, but you don't allow them to repeat them. That's how you lead. That's how you create real change." Daniel looked at his mother as if he had found the support he had been unable to find all day. "But I'm still afraid I've misjudged you." "Mom." Evelyn tilted her head. "Daniel, you can't control everyone. You can only open the door for them to enter the right path. Whether they go or not is their own choice." Daniel smiled slightly. A little light returned to his eyes. Just then, Daniel's phone rang. He opened it. It was from a veteran employee, Olivia Sanchez, who had been at Silver Monarch since the early days. The message reads, "Daniel, I just want to say, everyone is talking today, but most of them respect you more than before. They see you as fair but not cruel. They are just not used to this kind of leadership. Be firm. We stand behind you." Daniel read it a few times. then showed his mother the phone. Evelyn smiled deeply, her eyes shining with silent pride. "You see, there are things that you don't have to look for. They will come to you and give you the answers." Daniel nodded slightly. Finally, he stood up and made his mother a cup of hot tea from the bar. The steam rose from the tea, and the aroma was sweet. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the light reflect off the wooden table. But that night was not the last of the peace. Around 11:30, as Evelyn was about to leave, the restaurant door suddenly opened. The wind blew strongly, carrying with it a biting cold. A figure walked in. It's Mark. He stood in the doorway, panting as if he had just run a long distance. He held a small notebook in his hand. Daniel was a little startled. "Mark, why are you back at this hour?" Mark took a few steps forward, his eyes red as if he had thought a lot. I'm sorry for coming without notice, but I need to talk to you tonight." Evelyn quietly stepped back to let the two men talk. Mark opened the notebook, his hands shaking slightly. "Tonight. I'm writing down all the things that made me this way. Not to make excuses, but to never forget how lost I was." He looked up, his voice so low and sincere that for the first time Daniel clearly felt the change in Mark's eyes. "I don't want to just make things right. I want to be someone that those I hurt can look at, and not see contempt or fear." Daniel looked at Mark for a long time, then said, "Why tonight?" Mark replied. "Because I don't want to let myself sleep in regret. I want to start over, while I still have the courage." Evelyn stood smiling from a distance. She knew Daniel was right, and she knew Mark had just taken a step further than he had thought. Daniel nodded, his voice light but full of gravity. "Okay, Mark. So tonight, let's start over." Outside, the wind had died down. Seattle was quiet. The next morning, Seattle greeted a new day with a mild gray sky, the kind of weather that tends to make people think more. The Silver Monarch opened as usual, but the first person to walk in was not a bartender or a chef. It was Mark Harris. He arrived before the sun had fully risen. No one had asked him to be there early. No one had given him any orders. But Mark knew today he needed to start with something stronger than promises. Daniel arrived about 15 minutes later. He was a little surprised to see Mark standing at the bar, wiping down every surface with a more focused gaze than usual. Daniel asked. "You came so early." Mark stopped and looked up. "Mr. Carter, I think I need to learn from scratch, both how to work and how to be a person." Daniel looked at Mark for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. "Good. It's going to be a long day." Mark smiled slightly. "I know." As other employees entered one by one, many were surprised to see Mark working so early. Some looked suspicious, some hesitated, some even looked annoyed, as if they were not ready to see Mark change. But Mark did not respond. He bowed to each person, his voice small but sincere. "Good morning." Many people didn't respond, but a few nodded, and that was enough for Mark to continue. Around 10, Mom. Mary Ann suddenly called Daniel into the small office behind the restaurant. Her voice was a little tense. "Daniel, we have a problem." Daniel walked in and saw a brown envelope on the table. He asked, "What's up?" Mary Ann looked at him, somewhat finding it difficult to speak. "It's a letter of resignation?" Daniel startled. "Why?" Mary Ann exhaled. "Chris Jacobs." Daniel was silent for a second. He knew Chris was straightforward, but quitting when things were changing, it made him think. Mary Ann gave him the letter to read. Just a few short lines. "Mr. Carter, I respect you, but I don't feel I'm generous enough to work with Mark. I need time to rethink my direction." Daniel put the letter down. He didn't blame. He wasn't disappointed. He just felt a heaviness, as if someone had placed a rock on his shoulders. He asked, "Where is he?" Mary Ann said behind the restaurant. "He came early to deliver the mail and then stayed a while." "Daniel, go now." Behind the Silver Monarch, there was a parking lot overlooking a quiet residential area. Chris sat on the steps, his hands clasped together. Daniel approached, his voice calm as ever. "Chris." Chris turned back, looking tense and a little embarrassed. "Mr. Carter, I know my actions were untimely." Daniel sat down next to him. There is no absolute right or wrong when it comes to human emotions. It is your right to take a break. But I want to know, what made you decide so quickly? Chris looked down at the ground, I'm afraid. I don't have the strength to face the person who hurt me. I'm afraid I'll react negatively. And I'm also afraid I'll be even more disappointed. If it happens again? Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. Everyone has their limits. But do you think walking away will help you get past it? Chris was silent. Daniel continued. You think Mark won't change? I understand that. But I want to ask a question. Not about Mark. About you. Do you want to be the one who runs away? Or the one who is strong enough to stand where you are hurt and heal yourself? The question was a deep cut, but a necessary one. Chris swallowed, his eyes slightly wet. I don't know, Daniel said softly. No one knows, not even me. But you're not here alone. I'm here. Marianne's here. The team's here. And you have a choice about how you deal with it. Chris looked at Daniel for a long time. Then he asked, his voice as thin as a thread. Do you believe Mark has really changed? Daniel answered without thinking. No, I don't believe. I watch, and I give him the chance to prove it with his actions. You have the right to watch too. No one is forcing you to forgive, but you have the right to see if the change is real. Chris took a deep breath and nodded slightly. I need time, but I probably won't leave right away. Daniel smiled. That's enough for today. When they returned to the restaurant, Mark was in the kitchen helping prepare vegetables. Chris walked past him without saying anything. Mark didn't dare look directly at him. But as Chris walked away, Mark whispered loud enough for only he to hear. I'm sorry. Chris paused. A few seconds passed. But he said nothing, just continued his work. Daniel watched from afar. He knew the silence wasn't hostility. It was unpreparedness. And that was perfectly normal. At noon, when the Silver Monarch began to fill up, Daniel assigned Mark to serve a small area. All eyes were on him. Mark was a little nervous, but he began to greet the guests in the softest voice he could. Just a few minutes later, the first opportunity arose. An elderly female guest called, Excuse me. Waiter Mark stepped back. Yes, ma'am. How can I help you? She said I ordered salad, but the portion of vegetables is too small. Can you change it for me? Mark bowed his head. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'll bring you another portion right away. He turned away. No argument, no attitude. An employee saw and whispered to the person next to him, Today, Mark is different. Another person replied, Let's see how long he lasts. Daniel heard those words, but did not intervene, because he knew change is not something that can be demonstrated in a day, but in many days. Toward the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned out, Chris approached Mark. He looked at Mark for a few seconds and said a simple sentence. Thanks for doing the right thing just now. Mark was a little startled. But then he said, I will try. Every day. Chris nodded and left. It was a small gesture, but Daniel saw it clearly. The movement in the team had begun. At the end of the day, Daniel noted in his notebook Mark's first day of real effort. Staff are more observant than before. Trust is being tested, but also being rebuilt. Evelyn came to the end of the session, looked at her son who was taking notes and asked, How are you today? Daniel sighed but smiled. Better than I thought. But, you know, the road to healing is long. Evelyn put her hand on Daniel's shoulder. But the most precious thing is that you dare to start. Daniel looked out the window. The Seattle wind had calmed. And inside the kitchen, he knew one thing tomorrow would be the next step. For Mark, for Chris, and for himself. That evening, the Silver Monarch was quieter than usual. There were no more tense whispers, no more awkward glances like the past few days. Instead, the atmosphere softened, as if the whole restaurant was taking a deep breath after a series of stormy days. Daniel stayed behind. He walked around the restaurant, as was his custom. He touched every chair, every table, every hanging lamp. The Silver Monarch was more than a restaurant to him. It was a memory of his mother, of himself, of the wounded but hopeful journey they had taken together. Marianne walked out of the management office, holding a file in her hand. Daniel, she called softly, do you have a minute? Daniel nodded. What's up? Marianne handed him the employee evaluation report for the past 2 weeks, but then she just smiled. Not a report. I just wanted to say, you did great. Daniel was surprised me. Marianne nodded firmly. Not everyone has the courage to stand firm when things get tough, and not everyone has the patience to give others a chance at betterment. You did both. Daniel smiled softly. I don't think I did anything great. I just did what needed to be done. Marianne looked at him, her eyes softening. The must-do things are sometimes the hardest things to do. Daniel thanked her and saw her out. When he turned back, he saw Mark standing near the kitchen door, as if hesitating about something. Mark stepped back, his hands clasped together. Mr. Carter, may I speak a word? Daniel nodded. He leaned lightly against the bar while Mark stood opposite, his eyes lowered, but his voice no longer trembling. I want to thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me in the first place. I didn't deserve it. I know, but you still gave me a chance. I want to say, I won't let you down again. Daniel looked at Mark for a long time, not to judge, but to feel the sincerity that had rarely appeared before in similar conversations. Mark, he said slowly, I gave you a chance because I believe there is good in everyone, but it is up to you to keep that chance. And I think you are doing the right thing. Mark looked up, his eyes brighter than usual. I will continue, not because I want to make amends, but because I want to be a better version of myself. Daniel smiled. He didn't need to hear more, and he knew Mark's journey was just beginning, but it was on the right track. Just then, a familiar figure entered the front door. Evelyn. She wore a dark brown sweater, her face a little tired from the long day, but her eyes were still gentle and warm as always. Daniel came to take the shirt from his mother's arms. Mom come to pick me up. Evelyn smiled. Sometimes I also want to see how you are living after the stormy days. Daniel pulled out a chair for her to sit at a table near the window. The Seattle streetlights reflected off the glass, creating shimmering streaks of light like memories. Evelyn leaned her arms on the table, her eyes full of thought. Son, you make me proud. Daniel laughed. Mom said that just to make you less stressed. Evelyn shook her head. No, I faced what many people avoid. I didn't retaliate against Mark when I had the chance. I didn't push him away because of his past mistakes. I gave him something that not everyone gets in life, a second chance. Daniel pondered Mom. Sometimes I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing. Sometimes I worry that I'm being too soft. Sometimes I worry that the staff will think I favor Mark. Evelyn put her hand on his. No matter what you do, people will have opinions. It's important that you stay true to your heart. And your heart, Daniel, is what has kept this restaurant going. Daniel bowed his head, a warm feeling spreading in his chest. After a few minutes, the kitchen door opened. Chris emerged, his apron still slightly wet. He looked around, saw Evelyn and Daniel, and approached. Hello, Mrs. Carter, Chris said, looking confused but happy. Evelyn smiled. Hi, Chris. My son tells me you're doing great. Chris blushed. I just try my best, Daniel asked. Are you going home yet? Chris nodded. Okay, but before I go, I want to say this. I want to stay, to work here. I don't know if I can completely forgive Mark, but I want to try. I want to see if we can work as a team. Daniel smiled slightly. Thanks for that. At that moment, Mark stepped out from behind Chris. They faced each other for a few seconds. No words were spoken, but Mark's eyes held something Daniel had never seen before. Respect. Chris nodded slightly at Mark. Mark returned a smaller, but sincere nod. Daniel looked at that scene, his heart suddenly filled with an indescribable emotion. It was as if the storm had finally left the sky of the Silver Monarch, leaving a peaceful space for everything to start again. Evelyn stood up and took her cloak. Come on, son. I want you to go to bed early. Daniel nodded to everyone and walked out with his mother. As they passed through the main entrance, Evelyn paused for a moment, looking at the Silver Monarch sign glowing in the night sky. She said, You know, this restaurant is a place where you help people be seen, not just the customers, but people who are hidden in their own lives. Daniel was silent, letting each word sink in. Then she added, Keep it up. Daniel smiled softly but deeply. As the restaurant door closed behind them, He caught the smell of the Seattle night, the smell of new beginnings. Tonight, there were no winners or losers. There was only growth. There were people who chose to look at each other differently. And sometimes, as Evelyn would say, that's enough to change a life. The story of Evelyn Carter and her son, Daniel, is more than just discrimination in a fancy restaurant. It is a gentle but powerful reminder that how we treat others says more about us than any introduction. In life, we often judge others by their appearance, their skin color, the way they dress, or their age. But we don't know what they've been through, where they've come from, or who they are in the lives of those around them. Mark, the erring waiter, is a picture of people who make mistakes but can change. Chris, the hurt one, shows us that forgiveness is not always the end, but it is always the beginning of growth. From this story, we learn that kindness is not loud, respect is not conditional, and change sometimes begins with a slower look, a deeper breath, a gentle but right choice. Even though life is unfair at times, we can still choose to be the one to make the world a little easier to breathe. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it brings you some thought, some warmth, or just a moment of silence, I'm so grateful for your company. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell each other healing and humane stories. Are you ready for the next story? I'm always here to tell it.